The bride market at Westgate Crossing had sold 11 women by midday when Kaela of the Shattered Ram was shoved onto the block. 12 campaigns scarred her body, 7 command kills, a war debt she didn't owe. Buyers inspected her teeth, her muscle, her obedience. Then a quiet farmer stepped past the auctioneer, ignored the bid sheet, and asked a single question that stopped the yard cold. "What's your name?" Kayla of the Shattered Ram wasn't just another war prize. Beneath her scarred armor and the obedient silence beaten into her by years of campaign, she carried a secret that the magistrate of Westgate would do anything to bury. The original deed to the Ashwood Marches, the land of her noble Orc house, stolen from her family through forged writs. The magistrate himself had orchestrated her sale into the marriage market to send her far from the capital, far from anyone who might listen. But the quiet farmer Eli didn't inspect her like livestock. He asked her name, and that single question would unravel a conspiracy that reached straight to the county seat. Because Kayla had been waiting years for someone, anyone, to ask the right question. Now she had him. He didn't lead her out of the market like a purchase. He walked a pace ahead, not holding the tether the auctioneer had looped around her wrist. And when they were past the last stall, he stopped, produced the bill of sale, and tore it clean in two. "My name is Eli Hartwell," he said. "This isn't a receipt. It's garbage." Kayla watched the pieces flutter into the mud. In 12 campaigns, she had seen men purchase brides, weapons, and corpses, but she had never seen a man destroy a document that gave him ownership of an orc. She filed that away. They rode north in a cart meant for grain, not passengers. Eli didn't speak. He didn't ask her about the scars that laced her arms, or why she carried herself like a blade still sheathed, or why her tusks had been filed, not by a craftsman, but by a mercenary surgeon to make her less orc for the bidding. He just let the silence sit. The farm sat on the edge of the thornwood, a stone house with a slate roof, a barn in good repair, and a garden that had been planted in straight, disciplined rows. Not the home of a poor man. The home of a precise one. Kayla stepped down from the cart and scanned the tree line, the road, the windows. Instinct. Eli watched her do it. "You see threats," he said. "Good. The magistrate's riders come this far sometimes." That was the first time anyone had spoken of the magistrate to her without smiling. She turned. "Magistrate Gerald?" "The same." He held her gaze. "I know who sold you. I know why." She didn't answer. She had learned that silence was the safest vault. The story of the Ashwood Marches was written on the inside of her belt. Not metaphorically. The original deed, stamped with the signet of the Orcish House of Ashwood, was sewn between 2 layers of leather by her mother's hand the night the magistrate's men came with the forged writs and the torches. Kayla had been 16. Her father, Lord Rogath Ashwood, had refused to sign the surrender. He was executed 2 days later in the county square, his lands annexed by a paper that claimed he had sold them for war debts he didn't owe. The forgeries were clumsy, but Magistrate Gerald had the county clerk in his pocket, the garrison commander on his payroll, and a judge in the capital who owed him a favor. The Ashwood name was erased. Kayla escaped with the deed and a knife. She spent 9 years as a mercenary, building a reputation, waiting for a path back to the law. And then Gerald, learning that a female orc matching her description had been asking questions in the border towns, used an old mercenary debt as a pretext to have her arrested and sold. Far from the capital, far from anyone who would listen. Eli Hartwell was supposed to be just another quiet buyer who would use her for labor, and keep her silent. The first evening, he showed her a room with a door that locked from the inside. "You lock it," he said. "I don't have a key." She tested the lock after he left. It held. She sat on the bed, a real bed, not straw, and listened to the house settle. No footsteps approached. She didn't sleep. At dawn, she found him in the yard sharpening a long knife. The blade was a farmer's tool, but the stroke pattern, left side dominant, roll at the wrist, consistent pressure, was the stroke of a man who had been taught by someone who knew combat, not butchery. She recognized it because she had seen the same pattern in her father's arms master. Another piece filed. She began to assemble a portrait of Eli Hartwell. He rose before the sun. He worked the fields alone, with the economy of someone conserving energy for a long fight. He read at night, by candlelight, books on property law, county charters, the same border treaties that had shaped her family's claim to the Ashwood Marches. In the third week, she found him in the study, a map of the county spread on the table, the Ashwood lands circled in red ink. He looked up. "You told me your name was Kayla," he said. "Kayla Ashwood. That's what you said at the market." She didn't deny it. He tapped the map. "This land was stolen from the Ashwoods 9 years ago. The new deed holder is a consortium fronted by Gerald's brother-in-law, but the original deed was never invalidated. It's still the legal title if someone could produce it." She felt the belt tighten against her waist, the leather warm from her skin. Why would a farmer care about land law? He stood. "Because I helped forge those papers." The air left the room. Eli told it without flinching. He had been a junior clerk in the county surveyor's office 9 years ago. Young, idealistic, poor. Gerald had offered him 20 silver crowns to copy and alter a set of boundary records. He did it, thinking it was a simple land dispute between human settlers. He didn't know it was the Ashwood deed until the day after Lord Rogath was hanged. The guilt had eaten him. He resigned, took his savings, bought this remote farm, and spent 9 years gathering evidence against the magistrate, witness statements, the original falsified ledgers, a letter from the judge acknowledging the favor. But without the deed itself, he couldn't overturn the fraud. He'd been waiting for a sign. And then he heard that an Orc woman with Ashwood features was being sold at the border market. He'd barely slept the night before, hoping it might be someone who could help him finish the work. "When you said your name," he said, "I knew you were the heir." Kayla's hand was on her knife. "You profited from my father's murder." "I did, and I've spent every day since trying to undo it." His voice was steady, but his eyes were hollow. "You have the deed, don't you?" She didn't answer. He didn't press. He just said, "If you want to leave in the morning, there's a horse in the barn with enough provisions for 4 days. I won't stop you." Then he walked to his room and closed the door. She didn't sleep that night. She paced the yard, counting stars, counting the years of hiding. The man who had helped destroy her family was now offering her the tools to restore it. She hated him. She needed him. The next morning, she was sitting at the table when he came down. She had unstitched the belt and laid the deed, yellowed and creased, but unmistakable, next to his map. "I've been waiting 9 years for someone to ask the right question," she said. "You asked my name. That's the only reason you're still breathing." He didn't flinch. He sat down, examined the seal, the signatures, the surveyor's marks. "This is it," he whispered. "This is the original. With this, the forgeries are void. Gerald's whole house of cards collapses." "Then we go to the county seat," she said. "We present this to the circuit judge." The circuit judge is Gerald's cousin. He won't rule against him. We need the provincial court, 2 months' ride, and a petition that will wake every enemy Gerald has. And he'll know we're coming the moment we leave this farm. The window faced east. In the distance, a plume of dust rose from the road. Eli's jaw tightened. "There's a rider," he said. "Magistrate's colors." He turned. "Gerald must have learned who bought you. He's coming to finish what he started." The dust grew closer. Kayla slid the deed back into the belt and drew the knife from its sheath. "Then we don't run," she said. "We present. Right here." The dust cloud broke into 3 riders, not one. At the center, rigid as an iron spike, sat Magistrate Gerald himself. He had a constable's warrant folded in his glove, and he wore a civil smile that had hanged more men than any noose in the county. Behind him rode 2 men of the Westgate garrison, armed, lazy, the kind of soldiers who collected extra pay by not asking questions. Gerald halted his horse at the edge of the garden, where the rows of beans gave way to packed earth. He did not dismount. He looked at Kayla with the particular attention of a man cataloging an asset. "Farmer Hartwell," he said, "I see you've taken custody of a deserter. The mercenary bond on that orc was posted by the county prefecture, which makes her flight a property crime. I'm here to reclaim her." Eli stepped forward, empty hands visible. "She's not a deserter. She was sold at open auction with a bill of sale, which I tore up because it's not worth the ink." Gerald's smile didn't flicker. Bills of sale can be reissued, and the initial charge, debt evasion, still stands. I'll have the constable remand her until the circuit judge can rule. Kayla's knife was at her thigh, hidden by her cloak, the belt warm with the deed. She watched the guards, counting the seconds until violence became arithmetic. Then Eli did something she hadn't anticipated. He produced a leather portfolio from the bench beside the door, the same portfolio she had seen him reading at night, the one filled with county charters and, she now understood, much more. "You're welcome to try, Magistrate. But if we're discussing charges, I have a complaint to file. Forgery of land deeds, murder of a peer of the realm, conspiracy to defraud the Crown's survey." He held up a single sheet, a copy of the original falsified boundary record, with Gerald's own clerk seal, dated 9 years earlier. "Your name is all over these documents, sir." The magistrate's face went still. Not frightened, calculating. Kayla recognized the look. It was the expression of a man who had just decided that the legal approach was no longer the most efficient one. He drew off his riding glove, 1 finger at a time, and nodded to the guard on his left. "Search the farm, and secure the orc. If she resists, break her arms." That was the signal. The guards dismounted, hands on hilts, moving toward Kayla with the slow confidence of men who had done this to bound prisoners before. They had not factored in Eli Hartwell. He wasn't fast. He wasn't dramatic. But the hands that had sharpened a long knife every morning rolled with the first guard's wrist, turned it back against the joint, and sent the man gasping to the dirt with his own weapon clattering under the cart. The second guard lunged at Kayla. She stepped inside the lunge, not away, and the knife appeared from her cloak in a motion so practiced it looked like breathing. She pressed the edge to the soft hollow below the guard's ear. "I'm not a deserter," she said quietly. "I'm Lord Rogath Ashwood's daughter, and if you move, I'll show you what that means." The guard froze. The magistrate remained on his horse, expression unchanged except for a small tightening around the eyes. He was looking at Kayla differently now, not as livestock, but as a loose thread in a tapestry that had cost him 9 years to weave. Ashwood, he repeated. I should have executed you alongside your father, but then I would never have found the deed. Your mother hid it so well. He said it like a regret. You've carried it all this time. That's why you survived. Kayla's blade didn't waver. You killed him for land you couldn't even hold without a lie. Gerald's horse shifted beneath him. He gathered the reins. The lie is now the official record. No one in the capital cares about a dead orc lord, but I will have that deed, even if I have to burn this farm to get it. He wheeled the horse and rode back toward the road, leaving his disarmed guards in the dirt. I'll return with 20 men, he called over his shoulder. If you're still here, Hartwell, I'll charge you with harboring a fugitive and add your name to the gallows. The guards scrambled to their feet and ran after him. Eli retrieved the fallen sword and set it on the porch. His hands were shaking, but his voice was level. He needs the deed, because without it, the consortium that fronts his brother-in-law can't sell the Ashwood land to the Crown. The Crown is expanding its forest reserve. They're buying border territories for conservation and military roads. Gerald has been planning to pocket the sale. It's a fortune. He's been sitting on this for years, waiting for the right moment. You showing up with the proof would void the claim. He can't let that happen. Kayla looked at the road where the dust was settling, then at the sky. He'll come with men who don't care about law. Eli nodded. Then we go tonight. The provincial court sits in Harrogate, 12 days northeast. I have a contact among the Crown surveyors who will authenticate the deed and bypass the county judge. But once we leave this farm, we're fugitives. Gerald will brand you a violent escapee, and me your accomplice. Kayla wiped her knife on a cloth, slow and deliberate. I've been a fugitive since I was 16. But you're giving up everything. I gave that up the moment I copied those boundaries, he said. I've been cleaning the stain ever since. This is the last page. He turned toward the barn. Pack what you need. I'll saddle the horses and get the evidence files. But they weren't alone. The village of Thornwood had ears. The innkeeper's daughter, Mella, had been watching the farm from the copse of alders since the magistrate rode in. She was a quiet girl, often overlooked, and she had heard every word. Now she sprinted down the cart path to her uncle's cottage, with news that would shatter the brief calm. And what she carried in her head was not just the fact of Ashwood's heir, but the name of the Crown surveyor who was due to inspect the Ashwood lands the very next week. Gerald didn't know that yet, but Mella was about to tell him, not out of malice, out of fear. Her uncle owed Gerald 2 harvests of barley. Fear makes informants faster than gold. That night, under a moon thin as a coin scratch, Kayla and Eli led their horses out of the barn. The pack horse carried the deed sewn inside a saddlebag, along with the original falsified ledgers, the judge's incriminating letter, and a charcoal rubbing of the surveyor's seal that Eli had lifted from the county office years ago. They had provisions for 2 weeks. They had no illusions about what would happen if they were caught. As they passed the alder copse, Kayla caught a scent of wood smoke and something else, a human sweat, recent. She signed a warning, a brief hand signal from her mercenary days. Eli stiffened. They mounted and rode east into the dark, not on the roads, but through the forest tracks that hunters used. Behind them, a light flickered in the innkeeper's cottage window. A message was already being written. They traveled by night, sleeping in shallow caves and abandoned herders' huts. Eli's knowledge of the land proved deeper than she'd expected. He knew the hidden fords, the ravines that would swallow a posse's dust, the village where the constable was secretly a debtor to the Ashwood name from before the purge. They gained 2 days. On the 3rd morning, Kayla pulled him down into a thicket and pointed east. A column of smoke rose from the next valley, too large for a chimney. "Gerald's men are burning farmsteads," she said. "He's searching door to door." Eli's face was gray. "If they're burning, they've dropped the pretense. He'll declare martial law in the border towns." She looked at him. "Your contact in Harrogate, the surveyor. How much does he know?" "He knows I've been gathering evidence for years. He doesn't know I'm traveling with the heir." Kayla considered this. "Then Gerald doesn't know either. That's leverage. But we need to reach the surveyor before Gerald can forge new documents to counter us. If he learns about the Crown survey..." Eli finished her thought. "He'll alter the registry, change the parcel numbers, and our deed will be matched to a plot that no longer exists. The Crown won't question a magistrate with local authority. The forgeries will stand." That was when the pivot came. They had stopped at a spring below a rock outcrop, the only water source for miles. From the outcrop, a figure emerged, not Gerald's men, but a woman in the charcoal robes of a crown archivist, dusty from travel, leading a horse that looked nearly as tired as she did. She was young, sharp-eyed, and carried a satchel with the seal of the provincial survey. "I'm looking for a farmer named Eli Hartwell," she said, her voice cracked from thirst. "The innkeeper's daughter sent a runner. She said you'd be heading for Harrogate with a claim against the magistrate. I'm the Crown Surveyor's apprentice. My master is dead. He was killed on the road 3 days ago by men wearing no colors. Before he died, he told me that the Ashwood deed might still exist, and that I was to find you and verify it." She pulled from her satchel a rolled parchment, a blank official survey form, and a seal that was still bright with wax. "I can authenticate the deed right here if it's genuine, but you must show it to me now. Gerald's men are half a day behind me. They killed my master to stop this." Kayla's hand went to the saddlebag. The apprentice watched her with desperate urgency. This was the moment. Trust a stranger with everything, or risk that she was Gerald's plant. The silence stretched. Then Kayla made her decision, not with words, but with a single motion. She drew the deed and laid it flat on the rock. The apprentice knelt, examined the seal under a lens, traced the surveyor's marks with a finger. Her mouth formed words she didn't speak. Finally, she looked up. "This is authentic. It outdates the county registry by 9 years. With this, the Crown will not only void the forgeries, it will sanction the magistrate and arrest every officer who touched the case." She opened her satchel, pulled out ink and a quill, and began writing on the blank form. "I'm copying the deed's registration number now, and I'll stamp it with my master's provisional authority. That makes the deed legally recorded, before anyone can tamper with the county rolls." But the sound of hooves on stone was already climbing the valley. Gerald's riders had found the spring. The archivist's hand shook as she stamped the form and thrust it back at Kayla. "Go! Take the Ash Road north. It's a Crown-patrolled way. They won't dare raid it. I'll delay them." Kayla caught her wrist. "You'll die." "I'm a Crown officer. He can't kill me without a war." She met Kayla's eyes. "He already killed my master. Give me a reason to stay alive." Kayla pressed the knife into the woman's hand, the mercenary blade she had carried through 12 campaigns. "When we meet again, I want this back." Then she and Eli mounted and spurred hard north, the ash road a pale ribbon beyond the tree line. Behind them, the archivist stood in the path, holding the knife, as the magistrate's horsemen thundered into the clearing. But what she did next would alter the entire architecture of the conspiracy, because she wasn't just an apprentice. She was the niece of the provincial chief justice. and Gerald had no idea who he was about to threaten. The magistrate's horsemen thundered into the clearing with torches raised, and the archivist did not run. She stood in the center of the path, the borrowed knife held low and useless, and raised her voice in a tone that stopped men in their saddles. "I am Alessa Varden, apprentice to the Crown Surveyor and niece of Chief Justice Eddard Varden of the Provincial Court. Harm me, and you'll face a tribunal that even the King's writ cannot shield you from." The horses circled, snorting steam. Gerald shoved his way to the front, his face slick with sweat. He recognized the name. Everyone in the county knew the Chief Justice's name because it was the same family that had founded the law courts of 4 territories. He looked at her robes, at the seal she still clutched in one hand, and for the first time since this began, fear broke through the calculation. "You're lying," he said, but his voice was too quick. Alessa raised her satchel, still dripping from the spring water, and let the seal catch the torchlight. "My master was killed by men wearing no colors on the Harrowgate Road. You know who they were. And when I testify to that fact before my uncle, your magistracy will dissolve under your feet like wet chalk." Gerald's horse stamped backward. One of his riders, a younger guard, glanced at the others with the sudden unease of a man who had signed on for debt collection, not murdering a judge's niece. Gerald saw the hesitation and understood that his authority, built on bribery and threat, was cracking in the presence of a higher power. He did the only thing desperate men do. He doubled down. "Seize her documents," he ordered. "She's conspiring with fugitives. Any official seal she carries is suspect." But the men did not move. The younger guard let his torch drop. "Sir, that's the Chief Justice's blood. I won't touch her." A second man nodded. Gerald's face went paper white. He drew a short blade from his belt, not to strike, but to point. "You swore an oath to this county." The younger guard dismounted, unbuckled his sword belt, and dropped it in the leaves. "I swore an oath to the law, not to you." The other riders followed, one by one, until only Gerald's personal man, a scarred sergeant named Yarrow, remained mounted beside him. Alessa looked at the dropped weapons and back at Gerald. "You killed my master. You stole land from a noble house. You sold their heir as livestock. I have the original deed, authenticated under provisional crown seal, and a copy is already on its way to Harrowgate with the river traders. Even if you kill me tonight, you are already finished." She hadn't actually sent a copy to Harrowgate yet, but she knew the power of a bluff delivered with absolute confidence. Gerald knew it too. He swallowed, hard, and the blade wavered. Then Yarrow grabbed his reins and started pulling him back toward the road. "You can't fight the whole province, magistrate. Let's go." They retreated into the dark, the horses crashing through the undergrowth. Alessa stood trembling for a full minute before sinking to her knees. The younger guard approached and knelt beside her. "Ma'am, I'll escort you to the Ash Road myself. My name is Perrin Hold. I'm sorry for what my company did." She looked up. "Then start making it right. Take me north. I need to reach my uncle before Gerald can twist the story." And so, the chase reversed. The magistrate, now stripped of half his men, fleeing to salvage what he could, while the archivist, escorted by one of his own guards, rode hard toward the only man in the province who could bring the whole apparatus of justice down on a corrupt county. But here's what none of them knew yet. Gerald's conspiracy was not just the Ashwood Marches. The sister of the county clerk, who had helped forge those original writs, had married into the Harrowgate Commission of Lands. For years, the magistrate had been using the same method, killing border nobles, planting forgeries, and reselling the land to the Crown Forest Reserve expansion to accumulate a hidden fortune. By the time Kayla's deed surfaced, 12 other families had been erased, and Gerald's brother-in-law, Commissioner Renfrew, had just been appointed to oversee the authentication of all pre-Crown claims for the entire Northern Territory. If the deed reached the capital, it wouldn't just be Gerald on trial. It would be a network of officials stretching from the border to the provincial seat. And that network was willing to burn the whole county down to protect itself. Kayla and Eli reached the Ash Road by dawn. The road was wide, paved with pale stone, and patrolled by Crown Rangers who could not be bribed by any local magistrate. For the first time in days, they rode openly. Eli's face was hollow with exhaustion, but Kayla saw something new in the way he held his shoulders. The rigid discipline of a man who had carried guilt for 9 years and finally saw a chance to set it down. The Harrogate Courthouse archives are held by a recorder named Luther Morse, he said. She's incorruptible. If we get the deed logged there before Gerald can submit a counterclaim through his brother-in-law, the Crown will seal it as the official record. No county judge can touch it. Kayla tightened the saddlebag across her chest. How long until Gerald files a counterclaim? If he rode through the night, he could be in Harrogate by tomorrow evening. But he'll need his brother-in-law's signature to block the deed. That takes time. We might have a day. They pushed the horses harder. The ash road cut through a valley of standing stones, ancient markers from a time before the kingdom's charters. As they rode, Kayla began to talk, not out of nervousness, but out of the peculiar intimacy of shared danger. She told Eli about her mother, who had sewn the deed into the belt the night the torches came, and who had died of fever in a refugee camp 2 winters later, with only a wooden charm and the belt to pass on. She told him about the mercenary years, the captains who stared too long at her tusks, the contracts she took for less pay than her male squad mates, the slow accrual of a reputation that made it impossible to hide and impossible to go home. In return, Eli told her about the morning after Lord Rogath was hanged, when he had stood in the market square and watched the body being cut down, and had thrown up behind the blacksmith's shed. He had walked into the county surveyor's office and tendered his resignation before noon. He had been 18. The guilt had never left him, but it had given him a purpose, to learn every inch of land law, every chain of custody, every precedent that could unwind a fraud. He had become the thing he feared most, a clerk who knew how to use the system. And now he was about to use it against the man who had corrupted it. At midday, they passed a ranger station perched on a ridge. The captain, a woman with a scarred cheek and a crown insignia, flagged them down. "You're the ones from the Thornwood," she said. It wasn't a question. Word travels fast. Kayla's hand went to her empty knife sheath before she remembered she had given the blade to Alessa. "Is there a warrant?" "No. We've received a request from the provincial court for safe passage of 2 travelers, fitting your description, carrying documents of Crown interest. A certain archivist sent a rider ahead." Eli exhaled. Alessa had gotten through, or at least her message had. The ranger captain offered fresh horses and a 2-ranger escort to the Harrogate gates. "The Commissioner of Lands has been notified that a pre-Crown claim is incoming. He's requested a preliminary review. But something's off." She leaned closer. The request didn't come from the Commissioner's office. It came from a magistrate in Westgate who claims the deed is a forgery and that you're fugitives. The Commissioner is his brother-in-law. They're setting up to block you before you reach the recorder. Kayla's jaw tightened. "What's the Commissioner's name?" "Renfrew. Thomas Renfrew." Eli went pale. That's Gerald's man. If he's already filed a challenge, we need to bypass the commissioner entirely and go straight to the Chief Justice, Alessa's uncle. The ranger nodded slowly. That's higher than I can authorize, but the Chief Justice's chambers are in the East Tower. I'll send word ahead through the ranger network. If he's willing, he'll grant you an immediate hearing. But you'll have to present the deed directly. They rode into Harrogate as the sun was setting. The city was a walled hive of stone towers and courthouses, the provincial capital where law was not a rumor, but a commodity. The gates were thick with guards, but the rangers' insignia parted them like a key. In the streets, people stared at the orc woman riding beside a human farmer, her tusks filed and her scarred arms bare. Kayla ignored them. She had spent 9 years being stared at. Eli guided them toward the East Tower, a spire of black granite with the scales of justice carved above the door. But as they approached, a figure stepped from the shadows of the portico. Commissioner Renfrew himself, a plump man in velvet with a chain of office that glinted in the torchlight. He was flanked by 4 armed county deputies, not Crown Rangers. "Farmer Hartwell," Renfrew said, in a voice greased with false welcome. "You've come a long way to file false papers. I have a sworn statement from Magistrate Gerald attesting that the deed you carry is a fraudulent copy, created by the orc who murdered her own Lord Father to steal his title. Under the Provincial Land Act, I have the authority to impound suspicious documents pending full investigation. Hand it over." Eli didn't move. "You're Gerald's brother-in-law. You're a party to the fraud. You have no jurisdiction." Renfrew smiled. "I have deputies and a seal. I can have jurisdiction in 5 minutes." The deputies drew their clubs. Kayla measured the distance, the cover, the odds. 4 to 2, but they were not soldiers. They were hired muscle. She could take 2. Eli could take 1, maybe, but the 4th would raise an alarm, and the courtyard was full of people. This was not a back-road skirmish. This was the seat of law. Violence here would brand them as outlaws regardless of the deed's authenticity. And then the great doors of the East Tower swung open. A man stepped out, tall and gaunt, in robes of deep crimson, carrying no weapon except the weight of his office. Chief Justice Eddard Varden had the face of a man who had listened to liars for 30 years and could hear a falsehood before it was spoken. Behind him stood Alessa, pale but upright, and beside her, the younger guard, Perrin, now in Crown Ranger colors. "Commissioner Renfrew," the Chief Justice said, his voice carrying across the courtyard like a bell over water. "I have received a provisional authenticated copy of a pre-Crown claim for the Ashwood Marches, filed under the seal of the Crown Surveyor, witnessed by my niece. I also have a statement from a former clerk named Eli Hartwell, detailing the forgery of records in the Westgate Surveyor's office 9 years ago, with supporting documents. And I have a complaint from a Kayla Ashwood, heir to the Ashwood Marches, alleging murder, fraud, and unlawful enslavement. You may impound nothing. Step aside, or I will have you arrested for obstructing justice." Renfrew's smile evaporated. He glanced at his deputies, who had already lowered their clubs at the sight of the Chief Justice. The political arithmetic was suddenly simple. Defend a corrupt magistrate against the highest judge in the province, or retreat and try to salvage something later. He stepped aside. The deputies melted into the crowd. Kayla and Eli dismounted, and Alessa rushed forward to embrace them, then pressed something into Kayla's hand. Her knife. "I told you I'd return it," she whispered. "Now come. My uncle will convene the court tonight. You're going to present everything." They walked into the East Tower, as the bells tolled the 8th hour. In the chamber of the provincial court, beneath a ceiling painted with the constellations of the kingdom's founding, the Chief Justice took his seat. The room was filling with clerks, recorders, and the curious public who had heard rumors sweeping the city. Kayla stood in the center, the deed in one hand, the knife in her belt, Eli at her side. Gerald was not there. He was still riding toward Harrogate, unaware that his brother-in-law had just been neutralized, or that his name was about to be read into the permanent record of the Crown. But the night was not over, because Commissioner Renfrew, dismissed but not defeated, had one card left to play. A fire in the archives, set to destroy all evidence of similar frauds across 12 other families, and to burn the judicial copy of the Ashwood deed that Alessa had sent ahead. If that fire started before the court could record the original, the only surviving proof would be the paper in Kayla's hand. And Renfrew's men were already in the archive basement with oil and flint. The archivist's copy was already inside the great iron document chest when the first tongue of flame licked up the basement stairs. The fire caught the oil-soaked rags Renfrew's men had stuffed between the shelving racks, and for a terrible minute the whole ground floor of the archives glowed orange. But the Crown Rangers were faster than the flames. Perrenhold, the former guard who had switched sides at the spring, had been posted at the archive door by the Chief Justice precisely because he knew the building's layout. He smelled the smoke before the first alarm bell rang, kicked open the basement hatch, and found 2 men crouched over a pool of burning oil, trying to light a second bundle. He disabled the first with a chair leg, and the second with the memory of everything he had watched Gerald do without consequence for 3 years. The fire was smothered before it reached the document stacks. The archive keeper, Luther Morse, personally carried the chest containing the Ashwood copy upstairs into the courtroom, still trailing wisps of smoke, and set it on the evidence table before the Chief Justice. Renfrew's last play had failed, and when the commissioner saw the wet, singed but intact seal on the chest, he tried to slip out of the chamber through a side door, only to find 2 rangers waiting with manacles. "Commissioner Renfrew," the Chief Justice said, watching him being led back to the front of the room. "Your attempt to destroy Crown evidence has been witnessed by a dozen officers of this court. You are remanded into custody on charges of arson, conspiracy to obstruct justice, and accessory to murder. Your property and records are hereby seized." Renfrew's face collapsed. The chain of office was lifted from his neck by a bailiff, and he was taken to the same holding cells where the men he had enriched had sent so many of Gerald's victims. The courtroom filled. The bells of Harrogate summoned every clerk, every notary, every idle spectator who had caught the rumors swirling through the city. By the time Kayla walked to the center of the marble floor, the room was standing room only. She wore clean clothes that Alessa had provided, a simple tunic of dark wool, but she had refused to hide her scars. Her arms were bare. Her filed tusks, which she had always considered a mark of survival rather than shame, caught the candlelight. She held the original deed in both hands, the leather of her belt still showing the stitch marks where it had hidden for 9 years. Eli stood a pace behind her. Alessa had given him the portfolio containing the original falsified ledgers, the judge's letter, and the charcoal rubbing of the surveyor's seal. Chief Justice Varden called the court to order. "We are here to determine the validity of a pre-Crown land claim filed under the seal of the Ashwood Marches. The claimant is Kayla Ashwood, sole surviving heir of Lord Rogath Ashwood. The opposing interest, represented by Magistrate Gerald of Westgate, alleges that the deed is a forgery and that the claimant is a fugitive from justice. However, Magistrate Gerald is not present. A rider sent by this court has been dispatched to intercept him, and we will not delay justice for a man who has burned farmsteads to suppress evidence. Gerald hadn't reached Harrogate. He had been slowed by the loss of his guards, by the Ash Road's patrols, and by a messenger who had caught him on the road with news that his brother-in-law was already in chains. According to the ranger report, he had turned his horse west toward the border and was last seen riding for the mountain passes where extradition treaties didn't reach. But the law of the province would follow him. For now, the hearing would proceed without him. Kayla was called to speak. She had imagined this moment since she was 16, crouched in a refugee camp, her mother's body still warm, the belt the only thing holding her together. She had imagined it in the mercenary camps, when captains paid her in stale bread. She had imagined it on the auction block, when men inspected her teeth. Now she stood before the highest judge in the province, and she did not falter. "My name is Kayla Ashwood," she said, and her voice was not a plea. It was a statement. "My father was Lord Rogath. He was murdered by Magistrate Gerald and the men who stood to profit from his land. This deed, this paper, was sewn into my belt by my mother the night they came. It has been against my skin for 9 years. I have killed to protect it. I have starved. I have been sold. And I am still here." She placed the deed on the evidence table beside the archivist's authenticated copy. Eli stepped forward and laid out the falsified ledgers, the judge's letter, the charcoal rubbing. Every document in this portfolio was created or handled by Magistrate Gerald during the year my father was executed. I was a junior clerk in the surveyor's office. I forged the boundary records under Gerald's orders. I have carried the guilt of that act for 9 years. Today, I submit myself to the court's judgment. But the deed is genuine. The recorder, Luther Morse, examined the documents under a magnifying lens in full view of the chamber. She compared the seals, the watermark, the surveyor's notation. The room held its breath. When she straightened, her voice was dry but certain. The original deed predates the county registry by 9 years and 3 months. The surveyor's marks are consistent with the Crown standards of that period. The seal matches the Ashwood signet on file in the provincial archives. Based on the physical evidence and the testimony of the archivist, I certify this deed as the authentic pre-Crown title to the Ashwood Marches. The subsequent registry, filed by Magistrate Gerald, is a forgery and is hereby voided." The chamber erupted, not in chaos, but in the rustle of 100 people exhaling a breath they had not known they were holding. The Chief Justice's gavel brought silence. "The court finds that the claimant, Kayla Ashwood, is the rightful holder of the Ashwood Marches in fee simple, free of any encumbrance falsely registered by the Westgate Prefecture." He paused. "Regarding the accused, Eli Hartwell, you have confessed to the crime of forgery in open court. That crime carries a sentence of up to 5 years in the provincial prison. However, the court recognizes your voluntary confession, your 9-year effort to gather evidence, and your instrumental role in preserving the original deed and bringing the true criminal to light. The sentence is commuted to time already served in conscience. You are free." Eli's legs nearly buckled. He caught the edge of the evidence table, and Kayla's hand was there before he could fall, not holding him up, but resting on his arm, an anchor. The gesture was not lost on the room. The Chief Justice allowed a small pause, then continued. "The court further orders the immediate arrest of Magistrate Gerald on charges of murder, forgery, and unlawful enslavement. A warrant will be issued for all known co-conspirators, and the Crown will conduct a full audit of the Westgate County records to identify any other families whose lands were stolen by the same network. There were 12. He looked at Kayla. You are not the only heir who has been waiting. That was the final surprising detail, the one that shifted the scale from personal victory to systemic reckoning. Because when the Crown audit began the following week, it discovered that Gerald's method had been used on 12 noble families, human and orc, along the borderlands. The consortium that backed him had been buying the stolen deeds at auction through a chain of shell buyers, then reselling the land to the Crown Forest Reserve at inflated prices. The scheme had generated more gold than the provincial treasury held in reserve. And every one of those families had a surviving heir, or a distant cousin, or a retainer who had carried a piece of paper just like Kayla's, waiting for the day someone would ask the right question. The news of the verdict reached Thornwood before Kayla and Eli did. By the time they rode back into the village, the magistrate's manor was boarded up, and the Westgate garrison had a new captain appointed by the Crown. The burning of farmsteads stopped. The families who had hidden in the hills came down, and the innkeeper's daughter, Mela, who had been forced to inform on them out of fear, stood in the road with a basket of bread and a shaking apology. Kayla dismounted, looked at the girl who could have gotten them killed, and said, "You told the truth to the archivist. That's the only reason she found us. Fear didn't make you a traitor. It made you human. And you can make it right." The Ashwood Marches were restored to Kayla by Crown decree, but the land was not what she had expected. The manor house had been stripped. The old orchard had been logged. The tenant farms were empty, abandoned during the years of legal limbo. Eli stood beside her at the boundary stone, where the Ashwood seal was still faintly carved. "It's not what it was," he said quietly. "No," Kayla said, "but it's mine, and I'll rebuild it." She turned to him. "You were a clerk. You know land, law, and how to farm. I was a mercenary. I know defense, strategy, and how to lead. The Ashwood Marches need both." He understood what she was asking. It was not a contract. It was not a political arrangement. It was a partnership, offered by a woman who had been sold as property, and who would never, ever be owned again. "I'll stay," he said, "for as long as you want me." "Then stay permanently," she said. "Not as a tenant, not as a debtor, not as a man with guilt to scrub. Stay as my equal, because I choose you." The bonded ceremony was held in the stone hall of the Ashwood Manor, rebuilt by the hands of mercenaries Kayla had served with, and villagers who had sheltered them during the flight. Chief Justice Varden himself officiated, as a gesture of Crown reconciliation. Alessa stood as the witness. Perrin Hold, now a Crown Ranger, guarded the door with the same chair leg he had used in the archive basement, carved into a ceremonial baton. And Lilra, no, Elra is not a character in this story. I must be careful. The original transcript had a child, but our story does not. There is no Laura, but we have Alessa Perrin, the archivist. That's fine. The ceremony was simple. No bride price, no auction, no bill of sale. 2 words spoken by both. I choose. And when Kayla clasped Eli's wrist in the traditional Ashwood manner, her scarred hand over his, the people who had gathered in the hall saw something they hadn't seen in the borderlands for a generation. An orc and a human standing together not because the law demanded it, but because they had walked through fire and found each other on the other side. The Ashwood Marches prospered. The Crown's restoration grant brought new tenants, new orchards, new granaries. Kayla used her mercenary contacts to establish a border patrol that protected the farmsteads from the same kind of raiders that Gerald had once paid. Eli became the steward of the land records, ensuring that every deed was properly filed, every boundary stone reset, every family's claim preserved. The 12 other families, whose heirs were found through the audit, were offered the chance to settle on Ashwood land while they rebuilt their own. And the magistrate, Gerald, was finally captured trying to cross the eastern mountains by a ranger patrol that included Perrin Hold. He was brought back to Harrogate in chains, tried before the Chief Justice, and sentenced to life imprisonment. The last thing he saw before the cell door closed was the original Ashwood deed, framed in the courtroom gallery, with Kayla's name written beneath it in gold leaf. For Kayla, the victory was not the land. It was not the gold. It was the quiet morning 2 years later when she walked into the Ashwood village market. A free woman, an orc, a landholder, a wife, and saw a new bride sale being conducted on the county line. She walked to the auctioneer, placed the crown warrant on his table, and said, "This trade is illegal in Ashwood territory. Release these women, or I'll seize your stock and your license." The auctioneer stared at her tusks, at the scars, at the farmer beside her who was calmly holding a document binder. He released them, and Kayla offered each woman the same question Eli had asked her. "What's your name?" Because she knew now that the right question, asked at the right moment, could unravel a kingdom's worth of wrong. The Ashwood Marches became a sanctuary, a place where runaway brides, discharged mercenaries, and displaced families could build something new. The house that Eli and Kayla shared had a study with 2 desks, his and hers, facing each other. At night, they sat across from each other, working by candlelight, he on land petitions, she on patrol schedules, and the silence between them was not the silence of secrets, but the quiet of 2 people who had stopped hiding. The belt that had held the deed for 9 years hung on the wall above the hearth, empty. The knife Kayla had given Alessa was returned to her, and she kept it sharp, but she never had to draw it in anger again. And the quiet farmer who had asked a woman's name at a bride market proved that one man, paying the right kind of attention, could change the shape of history. In a world where people are reduced to their utility, their price, or their scars, the quietest revolution is to see a person. Magistrate Gerald saw land. The auctioneer saw a commodity. The guards saw an orc. Eli saw a woman. And the single question he asked at the bride market unspooled a conspiracy that stretched from border villages to the provincial capital, toppled a corrupt magistrate, unmasked a commissioner, and restored not just one noble house, but 12. All because a man who could have ignored everything instead paid attention. There is no law that compels a farmer to ask a stranger's name. There is no reward for refusing to tear up a bill of sale. There is no guarantee that one person's integrity will matter in a system designed by the powerful. But the story of Kayla and Eli teaches something that the maps and registries don't record. Attention is a weapon, and the people who use it never look the way we expect. They aren't generals or judges. They're quiet farmers with sharpening stones, tired clerks who carry guilt until they can turn it into restitution, archivists who stand in the path of horsemen with nothing but a seal and a name. The Ashwood Marches are still there. If you go north from Westgate Crossing, past the alder copse where the innkeeper's daughter once hid, you'll find a stone pillar carved with the Ashwood seal and a newer inscription beneath it. We choose. 2 words that don't appear in any marriage contract Kayla had ever signed before. That pillar was raised by the villagers she protected and the mercenaries she led, because after the verdict, after the restoration, after the magistrate was locked away, the border didn't fall back into shadow. It became something sturdier, A place where a former guard named Perrin trains Crown Rangers, where an archivist named Alessa continues to audit land fraud as the Chief Justice's most trusted investigator, and where a 6-year-old girl— No, that's not right. There was no child in this story. Let me correct that. A place where the people who had been displaced by Gerald's greed slowly found their way back. Not to reclaim what was stolen, but to build something that couldn't be stolen again. There is a question hanging over all of this. It's the same question Eli asked in the first seconds, and it's the one Kayla now asks every person who walks into her territory looking for refuge. What's your name? It seems so small. It isn't, because a name is the first piece of ownership anyone has. And if you can take that, you can take everything. But if you give it back, genuinely, without condition, you might just watch a kingdom change. If Kyla's story stayed with you, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments what question you think has the power to unravel a lie. This channel brings you stories of unlikely victors, shadow conspiracies, and the small moments that rewrite history. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it. We'll be in the comments, reading your names, because names matter.